So the name of the talk is LARP as part of a learning process. And that's a pretty big topic. I could literally go on for hours, but I only have 45 minutes. We'll see how that goes. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what is learning. Then I'm going to talk about what a learning process is. And the goal of this summer school is to teach you how to think about LARP design. When we make LARPs, there could be many possible reasons why we want to do it. Maybe we just want to create entertainment. Maybe we have artistic ambitions. Maybe we just want to figure out what happens if we mess with people. Or sometimes we want to make games that are designed for learning. And when we make LARPs that are designed for learning, there are some things there are some design considerations that apply that don't normally apply if you make LARPs for entertainment or for art. And I'll try to cover that to make this clear to you as designers. Also, previous years, there has been a talk called Accountability in EduLARP Design. That talk has been taken away. If I have time for it, I will try to touch a little bit on the accountability part as well, but I don't think I'll have the time. I'll use the blue star system that Jock employed on the talk about safety. So some of my slides has a blue star up in the left corner, and that's like if you take away 5 things, it's the 5 slides with blue stars on them. This talk also comes with a trigger warning for big and scary words. I study pedagogical theory, and in pedagogical theory there are a lot of big and scary words. Sorry. For most of you, English is a second language, and some of you don't like academic talk. I understand that. But at the same time, I think these words are useful if we're going to talk about this in a precise manner. And I also think they are useful for you when you're going to think as designers. It's good to know of them, even if you don't know all the articles that are written about them. It's good to sort of know that this is an idea. Before each big and scary word, I will show you a nice animated picture of a cute animal to soften the blow. And of course, I'll explain these words in a way that make them small and normal, regular words. Maybe not everyday conversation words, but I'll try to make this as easy and painless as possible. And the words aren't important, as I said. It's what's behind them and the implications of them. So, learning. What is learning? My field of study is pedagogics, as I've said many times now, and that's the study of how people learn. And there is no one theory of how learning happens. I'm not going to define learning for you right now because there are contradicting views on what learning is. In academia, we have this saying that all models are wrong, but some models are useful, and that applies to learning as well. I'm going to simplify things when I tell you how people learn, and that's because I think that is a useful simplification to use when we think about LARP design. Yes. I'll start with a different question. What happens when we learn something new? And I'll start with this guy. This is JeanPierre Share. He was born in 1896 and he died in 1980. He was from Switzerland, and he was a pioneer within the field of psychological development in children. And he did a lot of work on what happens when we learn. So, brace yourselves. Constructivist learning theory. I'll also read these in a silly voice. It's okay to laugh at the words. But this is the first one. So as I said, there are many theories. This is a theory about learning. It's not the theory. There are many others, and I won't cover them. So this is only one of them. Constructivist, what does that mean? It's sort of implied in the word that constructivists view knowledge as something we have to construct, we have to build it. I can't transfer my knowledge from my head to your head. I can't show you a picture of the inside of my brain and then you will understand something from that. You have to build that knowledge on your own. And that has some implications. We build that knowledge on top of our experiences. And Larp Design is designing experiences for people. So that means we can use Larp to create the best possible experience to build the knowledge we want other people to build. And that's a good thing. So I said what happens when we learn something new. Instead, I'll talk a little bit about what happens when we experience something new. Still Pierre Share, by the way. Assimilation Accommodation! Our brains are pattern recognition machines. They constantly try to figure out what to do with all the input they get from our senses. And they try to take those new signals and fit them together with the patterns that have been established by signals we have received in the past. Like all knowledge is in a way built on top of other knowledge we have. And that happens through this process that's called assimilation and accommodation. This is very simplified, but it's useful. Assimilation is when we take something new and we put it together with what is already established inside our heads, like the things we already know. For example, language is filled with patterns. And when a child learns to talk, one of the first things it figures out is that there are different words that sometimes are used, or different things sometimes have the same words. For example, everything you're sitting on is a chair. Chair is a word for the thing you're sitting on. And once the child has understood that this is the pattern, this is the system, it becomes possible to add other words. If the child sees or experiences something new, it will look for what is the correct word for this new experience or this new thing I'm encountering. And when that happens, it's assimilation. So if you compare building knowledge to building a house, this is sort of like filling the house you have with furniture. Accommodation, like if assimilation is filling your house with furniture, then accommodation, that's the thing that happens when you, in a fit of insanity, bought a car and then you realize that it's not room for your car in your living room, so you need to build a garage. It's like when you take the frame of reference you have and you have to expand it to make room for something new because it doesn't fit in. When a child has learned language, that these things are called chairs. If that's English is the child's first language, maybe the child comes to Norway and we are calling the chairs a stool. And that breaks with the pattern, like it was already called a chair, but it's also a stool. And then you have to make a new pattern that there are different languages, and these different languages are different systems of words. Like adding on to the frame, like making room for more patterns, that's accommodation. Sometimes accommodation doesn't happen. Like we experience something new and we don't learn from it. It's very possible to rationalize away our experiences. Like if something always has happened, like I always have a bad experience when I hang out with someone, and suddenly I have a good experience together with them. It's possible for me to think, oh, maybe I had the wrong idea of this guy, and I can change my idea about him, or I can just say, well, it was because it wasn't raining that day, and say, the guy is just the same. I'm not going to change my pattern. I rationalize it away. I can also disbelieve that I had a good time. I'm like, no, I must be wrong. I always have a bad time together with this person, so I probably had a bad time this time as well. And we do that all the time, especially the older you become, you generally do this much more. So, like assimilation, accommodation, that's good. Rationalizing away, that's bad. How do we make sure that accommodation happens? Then we're part of the talk that's about what a learning process is. And then we're going to go to a new guy who Eirik talked about in his history of role-playing talk. This is Kurt Lewin. He was born in Poland in 1890 and he died in Massachusetts, USA in 1947. And in many ways, he's like the godfather of educational role-playing. He had some really, really groundbreaking ideas about stuff. And there is like this fundamental insight that if you want to teach something to someone, they have to be willing to learn. If you're a parent, you know this. If you've ever been a substitute teacher inside the classroom, you know this. If you ever have had a friend who can't stop seeing their ex, then you know that like, if people don't want to learn, they're not going to learn. So Kurt Lewin has made this process for learning. And it's called unfreeze, move, refreeze, and it's really, really effective. I see this as sort of the holy grail of EduLarp. And if you're going to design a learning process, this is like the thing you have to remember. If you're making an EduLarp, you need to think about this. Since people have to be willing to learn for you to teach them, it's good to motivate them for the learning. This is what Kurt Lewin calls the unfreeze phase. You motivate someone to participate in the learning process. There are many different ways of doing this. For example, you can make people excited, or you can make them curious. You can throw them into a situation where what they know from beforehand isn't enough and they have to adjust. Luckily for us, LARPs are very exciting, and if someone hasn't LARPed before and they don't know that LARPs are exciting, they will probably be curious about it because it's different than from being in a classroom and learning in other ways. So sort of like the unfreeze phase comes very cheaply when we make EduLarps. And then it's the move phase. And the move phase is where new perspectives are presented. This is where the experience takes place. Your LARP happens in the move phase. And that tells us another thing that's important, and that's that most of the learning isn't going to happen during the LARP. Like during the LARP, you're exposed to a lot of impressions. You get all these new signals into your brain, like I talked about. And that's good. How do we take that experience and turn it into knowledge? That's where Refreeze comes in. This is where we integrate new perspectives as knowledge. Integrate new perspectives as knowledge. You might hear that that sounds a lot like the accommodation, assimilation thing, and it is. This is sort of like a three-step guide to how to create that accommodation. So as I said, most of the learning happens in the refreeze phase, and the refreeze phase happens after your LARP. And that means that if you're going to design an educational LARP, then you also have to design the process that takes place after the LARP. Are we good this far? So, some people will say that LARP is a first-person experience. What does that mean? Well, it means that your experience of the LARP is belongs to only you. Everyone has a different experience at the same LARP. Like, there will be similarities, probably, but your experience belongs only to you. And that's great, because we feel ownership over that experience. We sort of invest in that experience when it belongs to only us. And that makes it very, very useful. But you can see that like this text isn't centered in the middle of the screen, and that's because there's more here. And what's coming now is like the takeaway here. And because EduLARPs are first-person experiences, they are also very vulnerable to what is called confirmation bias. And I haven't made a big slide for confirmation bias. I understand that can be scary words as well, but like confirmation bias, that's something that happens when we experience things, because we're so focused on the experience that we constantly, like our brain, it wants to build these really smart patterns, so it constantly looks for the things that fit into the pattern. Like if it sees something that confirms the pattern we have already established, the brain will say, yeah, that's super important. And maybe it will just ignore things that aren't part of that pattern. And this happens all the time. It happens in science, it happens in finance, it happens in the schoolyard when someone don't understand that they're bullying other kids, and things like that, because it's not part of the pattern, so it becomes sort of invisible. And this has design implications when it comes to creating the stuff that's going to happen after your LARP. So this is, I've tried to sort of divide all LARP afterwork into 4 different things you will generally do after the LARP. Like Karete and Grete have a workshop about debriefs, and debriefs can be good and important after LARPs, but they are not the same thing as afterwork in an EduLARP context. The debrief is very often focused around the 2 on the top, recounting your own experience and listening to the other players' experiences. Recounting your own experience is good for sort of like figuring out what actually happened to me during this LARP. But it's not very useful for learning, because it centers only around what you have experienced on your own. And while LARPs create strong emotions in us and can be intense, if it's only an experience, it's not necessarily useful. For example, if I make an EduLARP about Syrian refugees coming to Norway, and my players, the only thing they do after that LARP is think about their own experience, and they're asked to reflect upon their own experience, then that's also what they're going to remember afterwards. And their own experience of being a Syrian refugee inside my LARP is not the same as being a Syrian refugee on the way to Norway. Is this clear? Great. So we can also listen to other players' experiences. That's useful, because sometimes the things we experience during the LARP isn't the same as the things that everyone else experiences during the LARP. Maybe I had one experience at this Syrian refugee LARP that is not very representative, while 9 other players had more exact experiences, or maybe they had more or less the same experience as me, but because of their background and history and the things they know when they go into the LARP, they interpret that experience in a different way. It's useful for me to hear the other players' perspectives, to realize like the full scope of the LARP, not only the parts that were my experience. So these things are good because they sort of like, yeah, you get all of the LARP, not only your part, not only the first-person experience. Another thing that I think it's really important to do is resolve any misconceptions after the LARP, because, as I said, we have a lot of fader talks about loyalty to the world, or is the LARP supposed to be playable, or is it supposed to be realistic? What's the name of the fader again, Martin? Plausible or playable. Have we had that fader talk yet? No. So I won't do all of it, but it's something you have to weigh up against each other as a designer. Am I going to focus only on realism, or am I going to make sure that my players don't die during the LARP I want to make, for example? So sometimes you do trade-offs that make the LARP less realistic. And if your players aren't aware about what parts of the LARPs are unrealistic, then they will get that confirmation bias thing again. Like they will go home and maybe they had a lot of misconceptions before the LARP started, and then they played the LARP, and then they got all their misconceptions confirmed. Then you need afterwards to talk about what was unrealistic, so they don't go home and think that the real world is just like the LARP. And then they have a wrong idea about what's realistic and unrealistic in the LARP. This is the same for all media. It's not only a problem in LARP. Like, if I make a movie, even if it's a documentary movie, I can't tell every part of all stories. I have to focus on something to show, and there will be things I don't show. And sometimes those things I don't show are crucially important. So you always run this risk. It's not only LARPs. It's the same if you put a film inside the classroom. But because of the first-person experience thing, I think it's extra important.
I can give a very concrete example. Sasha was talking about 1943, and one of the big things they wanted to do was for their players to be hungry. But they had told that before we played the game. So all the Belarusians, they had brought shitloads of food. And we ate like so much food during the LARP. I was so happy and well fed during the entirety of the LARP. So then we had to sort of discuss that after the LARP, that this was not what we were aiming for. We were actually aiming for people to be hungry, but that's also something that you can discuss. It's a lever for that.
It's a good example. I think also, like, the final part is the contextualize part, and that's where you take the experience at the LARP and you put it into the bigger picture. And I think Erik talked really, really well about that when he presented the Prisoner for a Day LARP. How important it is to show that this isn't only what you have experienced in your fictive LARP prison camp. It's like, what are the similarities by this fictive prison camp and the real world? What are the differences between this prison camp and the real world? So contextualizing is where you get the possibility to add input that wasn't in the LARP, but you can connect it to the LARP experience. And again, like, LARPs are really strong experiences. Strong experiences create feelings in us, and any neurologist would have to, I'm on a bit thin ground here, I'm not a neurologist, is the disclaimer here, but the amygdala, don't need to know that word, but the center inside your brain that handles feelings is closely connected to the center in your brain where learning starts. And there's a good reason for that. If you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, like, strong, intensive experiences are probably more important to your survival and your procreation. So it makes sense that we're better at remembering things that we have strong feelings about. So you can use a LARP to create really strong feelings about the subject in your participants, and then move on to have a lot of education that uses these hooks created by the LARP, these mental hooks, and you can, like, hang new information on top of those hooks in the classroom. And that's also why I think when you put LARP into and as a part of a learning process, it's often good to have the LARP at the beginning, not the end of it. LARPs are terrible for figuring out what students actually know. Like, they need to know enough to enter the LARP. I'll talk more about that afterwards, but the more time you have to spend on the subject matter after the LARP, the more you can utilize the potential that lies in that emotional connection participants get to the subject matter. You have to teach your players how to play your LARP, Jock said earlier this week. And that's true. When you come into LARP, you need to know what to do to get to experience the LARP. But I think there's another thing that's important, and I'm going to explain why now. If you're designing a LARP for learning, then you should also teach your participants how to learn at your LARP. Why is that? Okay, now this is like the worst one, I think, in the whole presentation. Metacognitive learning strategies! Okay, I'm going to break it down. Cognitive. Cognitive is a word for how does your brain, like the things that happen inside your brain when it interprets signals, like how does your brain sort information? That's the cognitive functions of the brain. Is that clear? Good. Metacognition is a slightly more difficult term, but it's a word we use for your understanding of how your own brain functions. So I'll take an example, a very real example. This happens every week. When I don't eat, I suddenly find pleasure in bugging and bothering the people around me. I become really, really annoying. And the annoying behavior kicks in way before I feel hunger. Like, my stomach doesn't feel empty, but I have already started bothering people. And because of that, I've learned to recognize that if I'm bothering people, I can say, maybe I should eat something because now I'm being really annoying. Or people who know that I am like that because I've told them can ask me, Magnar, maybe you should eat something, like Karete did before lunch today. And it took me several years to figure this out. Because it wasn't obvious at all to me that my personality shifted when I was hungry. Several years in a broken relationship is like what that knowledge is built on. So that's the other thing, like your brain has its own logic and it's not obvious to you. And sometimes others have to help you understand it, and some things are very similar between all people, and some things are similar between people who have shared experiences. But it's not obvious. But I think I've made you understand why it's useful to have this knowledge about metacognition. And why does it not just say learning? Why is it a learning strategy? Well, that's because different people employ different strategies for learning from their experiences. For example, two people who read the book in very different ways often. Some people will just sit down and read through a whole chapter and then put the book away. Other people will stop at the end of each paragraph and then reflect on what happened now before they move on. And as I'm going to explain to you, some learning strategies are very effective and some learning strategies are terrible. And most people don't have an intellectual relationship with their learning strategies. It's not something they think about a lot. It's just autopilot. Like, you have a default setting. How am I going to relate to this experience? Well, I'm going to relate to it like I relate to all of these experiences, how do I relate to all of these experiences? Probably the way you did the first time you experienced it, unless the way you reacted was really, really bad and you got corrected at once. So we have these habits that are just formed by pure chance, and that makes it sometimes difficult for us to learn in the best possible way. Like, the way we relate to our experiences is good enough, but it might not be very good. And that's what makes metacognitive learning strategies great, because they are based on a scientific understanding of what actually goes on in our brain. So they can be employed by usually almost everyone, and they're better often than what you would do on your own, because it's based on everyone's knowledge. And they're also great because they are skills. You can train them. Like if I tell you what is the most effective way of reading a book, then you can consciously, the next time you read a book, like, you can push yourself to read it in the way that I have told you is most effective. And it's going to be hard to change that habit. But once you have changed the habit, your reading permanently becomes better, because you've learned the metacognitive reading strategy. So, based on all of this, we can say that if you're going to be an effective teacher, you also have to teach your students how to learn effectively. And then we have to ask ourselves, what's an effective way of learning from a LARP? This is, by the way, not a blue star slide, but you can write it down anyways. But metacognitive learning strategies, in general, enable us to regulate and effectivize our own learning. And this happens through three functions of the brain that let us plan our own learning before we take part in the learning process. It helps us self-monitor during the learning process to make sure that we're getting all the stuff we're supposed to get. And it helps us control our own learning process by letting us check on the way, is this right or is this wrong? No, but this is like all effective learning is based on this, that you chunk up the learning. Like it's not, you don't reflect only at the end of the LARP, you reflect throughout the LARP. And for the participants to do this, you have to tell them to do it before the LARP starts, but you also have to leave space in your design for this to happen. Like you have to, it can't be all action all the time. It has to have pauses so players can stop and reflect, and you can build things into your LARP design that enables them to do this. Yeah. So, what am I looking for? Did I catch everything, and does it make sense to me? That are like the three general questions. And if you develop a habit of asking yourself those questions often, you figure more stuff out as you go. So, I've said, if someone goes to your LARP, you have to tell them how they should play your LARP. This, you can think that this is me going to your LARP. And I have a lot of questions. People have different questions. If they have never LARPed before, maybe the first question is, what is a LARP? You have to tell them that before the LARP starts. What do I do at the LARP? What do I do at this LARP in particular? If I have LARPed a lot, and then you say, I'm going to come to your educational LARP, is it the same as all other LARPs I have LARPed? I might assume that, and it could be entirely different. If I didn't know anything about black box LARPs and the methods that are usual to employ there, with using lights and sound to control the flow of the LARP, maybe not talk as much. And I come from a LARP tradition where it's mostly fantasy games in a forest, then my preparations can be way off for the LARP I come to. Often people will wonder, should I bring anything? Do I have to read up on something before I play your LARP? And have I prepared enough? I hate those Facebook groups that appear before LARPs because everyone posts pictures of their costumes, and I think I can never match that. I think that's terrible design. but these are questions everyone has before they come to your LARP. And then there are some questions that are specific to educational LARPs. What is the task I am given? And why was I given this task? This isn't just for educational LARPs, this is for education in general. If you're going to teach something to someone, it's useful for them to know what exactly they're going to be taught and why it is useful for them to be taught those things. How do I move forward to complete this task? Like, is there some special methods? If it's a LARP about Stone Age society and part of the LARP is working on making my own stone tools, then I have to know how to do that to participate in the LARP, or I have to be taught that as the LARP progresses. But it's good if I know beforehand, like we're going to do this inside the LARP. And either you have to figure it out beforehand, or you're going to get help practice it within the LARP. How do I know I have completed the task? Like, what does success look like, at least in Norwegian educational systems? And I think this is the trend in most of the Western world. The government employs a system of gamification that's called New Public Management to the learning process, and they state a lot of learning goals. And it's good to have learning goals, but participants need to know, am I reaching this goal right now? Have I reached this goal? And how do I show the teacher or you as the LARP organizer that I have reached the goal, that I have understood the thing I was supposed to understand? It's easier to participate if you're told this in advance. And I think an important takeaway from that is that if you design educational LARPs, you should be really careful with using the secrecy fader. Because if your participants are confused about what's going to happen, or confused in the middle of the LARP, then it's difficult to focus on the task at hand. So secrecy makes it more difficult to learn from the experience as it goes on, because you can't plan for the learning if you don't know what you're supposed to plan for. Metacognitive strategies, planning the learning process for yourself, not just have the teacher plan it for you. So I think that transparency is very good in EduLARP design. That's sort of like the end of that. And you remember the transparency fader from Maria's talk yesterday. Now I have 5 more minutes, and that means I can talk a little bit about accountability. And that's like, this is a pet peeve. This is going to be sort of a rant, but I think that when we try to talk about how good LARPs are for learning, because we love to LARP, we're LARPers, and we have learned things through LARPing, and we want LARPing to be a profession. We want, did I lose the sound again now?
Yeah, the microphone died again.
Your microphone
can just continue, maybe
because of your energy and your charisma.
Okay. So, we as LARPers often say that because LARPs are so fun, you learn more from them. And it's sort of right, but not quite. Because if something is fun to do, you want to do more of it. Like, fun is a great motivator for action. So if you manage to take something boring and turn it fun, that can be good, but sometimes that will also take away the challenging aspects or the difficult to reach aspects. And what you do then is that you lower the potential for learning from the activity. If something is only fun to do because it's easy and you've done it a lot before, then you don't necessarily learn a lot from it. So I think this is something that is really tempting to do, to make LARPs fun. Often, if you do an educational LARP and you talk with the participants afterwards, they will say, it would be even more fun if we did it this way. And you shouldn't always listen to that, because you as the LARP designer know that if we do it that way, then that ruins sort of the educational outcome. And I think this is really important to remember if you're going to make LARPs for schools, because teachers have a really tight schedule with their classes. It's really difficult, at least in Norway, to get through all of the curriculum, all the things you have to learn in a year. And then you have all these holidays and other things that happen that take away lessons. So if you're going to make a LARP about, for example, human rights and the prison situation, then you have to make sure that being 2 hours at that LARP is at least as productive as having 2 hours of classroom education about that subject. And that's not automatic. And that's the accountability part. That's your responsibility as a LARP designer. If you're going to be professional and you're going to make edu-LARPs and you're going to sell them to schools, you need to take responsibility of this. You need to think of what are the actual things participants are able to learn from my LARP, and can I make it better? Thank you. Yes?
So, if I have any particular skill to teach people, to train people, how can I generate LARP to do that?
That's very... the question was, if I have a skill, how can I use LARP to teach it to someone else? And the short answer is that depends on what the skill is. If it's a skill that takes a lot of practice, then it could be good to use the LARP to introduce someone to how to do it, but it's very rarely you learn something, you master something in a couple of hours, then you have to continue practicing it afterwards, but the LARP can be a good motivation. If it's knowledge in a field, you can use the LARP to let participants take part in a situation that reflects that knowledge. Sometimes you can use abstraction, and you can create a LARP that is in a way a metaphor for a situation. For example, if you want to teach about the global mechanisms that prevent governments from doing anything about global warming, you could make a mafia LARP where participants play criminals, and the more criminal they are, the more chance it is the police will come and crack down on their mafia organizations. And then afterwards you can tell them, okay, how is this similar to global warming? Well, maybe the mafia gangs are countries, and maybe doing crime is polluting, and maybe the police coming and stopping our criminal organizations is the global environment being destroyed. So it's possible to do it in that way as well. But I think if you know a lot about something and you use what you learn at this summer school about good LARP design, it's very possible for you to combine those things. You just have to think about what are the special requirements a participant who is there to learn have that are different from a participant who is just there to enjoy your LARP. Any more questions? Yes?
Can you just repeat those 3 questions that you mentioned for repeated asking during the learning process? You said 3 questions, please.
What am I looking for?
Yes. What am I looking for? I'll go back to the slide. What am I looking for? Did I catch everything? And does it make sense to me?
Say it one more time.
What am I looking for? Did I catch everything, and does it make sense to me? What am I looking for? Did I catch everything? Does it make sense to me? I think one more question, if anyone has it. Otherwise, I'll leave stage. Okay, thank you again.